Thomas had been lied to before, not the small lies, the kind where a contractor says he'll show up on Tuesday and arrives on Thursday, or where the estimate comes in a little high and everyone shrugs and moves on. He had been lied to in the deep, calculated, premeditated way that leaves a man standing in the snow, staring at a half-finished foundation he spent his entire savings on, watching a truck with out-of-state plates disappear down the only road that connects his property to the rest of the world. That kind of lie, the kind that takes something from you that you never fully get back. He was 44 years old when it happened. He had spent 19 of those years working on the North Slope, running equipment for one of the big oil contractors up near Prudhoe Bay. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one. He didn't gamble, didn't drink much, didn't spend money on things he didn't need. Over those 19 years, working 12-hour shifts in temperatures that cracked steel and froze diesel in the lines, he had saved just over $310,000. That number sat in a credit union account in Fairbanks and represented every sacrifice he had ever made, every holiday missed, every summer he spent on the slope instead of fishing the Kenai, every birthday celebrated over a satellite phone in a bunkhouse that smelled like insulation and boot rubber. He had a piece of land outside of Delta Junction, 22 acres, mostly spruce and birch, with a creek that ran clean along the eastern edge and a clearing large enough to build a proper house. He had owned that land for 11 years, paying the property taxes every year without fail, driving out to walk it when never got a stretch of days off, standing in the clearing and imagining what would look like with a house in it. A real house. Not a cabin, not a glorified shed, but a structure with insulated walls and a proper foundation, and enough room to spread out after 2 decades of living in bunk rooms and crew quarters. He found the builder through a referral from a man he knew slightly, a guy named Garrett who worked logistics for the same contractor and had built a place outside of North Pole a few years back. Garrett spoke well of the company, said they had done solid work, said the crew was professional. The company had a website, a license number, testimonials. Thomas met with the owner twice in Fairbanks, looked at photographs of completed projects, reviewed a contract that his cousin, who had done a year of paralegal training before dropping out, looked over and said seemed reasonable. Thomas signed it. He wrote a check for $160,000 as a deposit, which was just over half the total bid of $295,000 for a 1,800 square foot home on a poured concrete foundation with a full mechanical package. What followed was 8 months of excuses, partial work, rescheduled crews, and invoices of materials that Thomas never saw delivered. By the time the owner stopped returning calls entirely and Thomas learned that the company's license had been suspended 3 months earlier for issues with a project in the Mat-Su Valley, his $160,000 was gone. The foundation had been poured, badly, with improper grading that would collect water, and a partial frame had gone up that was nowhere near square. The contractor was eventually found, charged, and convicted of contractor fraud. He was ordered to pay restitution. Thomas received $11,000 over the following 3 years, in installments that came irregularly and stopped entirely when the man filed for bankruptcy. Thomas did not talk about it much. He told his brother. He told the investigator from the state licensing board. He sat in a courtroom in Fairbanks and gave a victim impact statement in a flat, even voice that he worked hard to keep steady. Then he went back to the slope and worked another 2 seasons, and he thought about what he was going to do. He was not the kind of man who quits on a piece of land. The idea came to him the way ideas often come to men who spend long stretches alone in cold places, slowly, through a series of smaller observations that eventually connect into something larger. He had seen Quonset huts his entire working life. They were everywhere on the slope, everywhere in rural Alaska, at remote airstrips, at mining operations, at fish camps and military installations and highway maintenance yards. He had worked inside them, eaten lunch in them, stored equipment in them. He had never once thought of one as a home, but he started thinking about why they were everywhere. And the answer, when he looked at it clearly, was not complicated. They worked. They had always worked. They were cheap to build, fast to erect, almost impossible to destroy, and they handled snow loads and wind and cold in ways that conventionally framed structures sometimes didn't. The arch form was not an aesthetic choice. It was an engineering solution that had been proven across a century of use in some of the harshest environments on Earth. He he started reading. He was not a reader by habit, but he became one that winter, downloading everything he could find on Quonset hut construction, steel arch buildings, owner-builder projects in cold climates. He learned that the original Quonset huts had been developed during World War II, mass-produced, prefabricated structures that could be shipped anywhere in the world and assembled by non-specialists in a matter of days. 16 feet wide, 36 feet long, a half-cylinder of corrugated steel that weighed almost nothing and could be put up with basic tools and a handful of men who had never built anything before. The military had erected hundreds of thousands of them. After the war, surplus huts spread across the country, repurposed as homes, workshops, storage buildings, churches, schools. Some of those original structures were still standing, 80 years later, doing exactly what they were built to do. What Thomas found, the deeper he read, was that the suppression of this building method was not accidental. It was structural. The residential construction industry in the United States was organized in a way that consistently steered buyers toward the most expensive solution, not because that solution was superior, but because it generated the most billable labor, the most material markup, the most opportunity for cost overruns and change orders and extended timelines. A conventional stick frame house required dozens of subcontractors in sequence: excavators, foundation crews, framers, roofers, siding contractors, insulation crews, drywall crews, finish carpenters, painters. Each trade created a handoff point, and each handoff point was an opportunity for delay, for additional charges, for the kind of scope creep that transformed a $295,000 bid into a $400,000 reality before the homeowner understood what was happening. The general contractor sat at the center of this web, collecting his percentage on every dollar that moved through the project, and the homeowner at the end of it had a structure that would need a new roof in 20 years and new windows in 30, and would require constant maintenance against the particular vulnerabilities of wood frame construction in a climate that tested every material it touched. The steel arch building disrupted every one of those dependencies. There was no framing crew because there was no frame. There was no roofing crew because the roof and the walls were the same continuous surface. There was no siding contractor, no sheathing crew, no exterior painting. The structure arrived as a kit. It went up with general labor. The number of specialized trades required was reduced to the genuinely technical work, the mechanical systems, and even those could be sourced and contracted independently without the markup layer of a general contractor sitting between the homeowner and the subcontractor. Modern versions were significantly more sophisticated than the wartime originals. Companies now made steel arch buildings in widths ranging from 20 feet to over 100, with options for insulated panels and wall framing, proper doors and windows, ridge vents and vapor barriers designed specifically for subarctic conditions. The engineering was solid. Arch structures distribute loads fundamentally differently than stick frame buildings, eliminating the need for interior load-bearing walls and allowing the snow loads that would stress a conventional roof to transfer down the curved surface into the foundation. In Alaska, where a heavy snow year could put 4 or 5 feet of accumulation on a flat or low-pitched roof, that was not a minor consideration. It was the difference between a structure that performed and one that didn't. The cost was what stopped him reading and started him calculating. A quality steel arch building kit, the steel panels, the hardware, the end wall framing materials, ran between $30 and $60 per square foot, depending on the manufacturer, the specifications, and the options selected. For a structure with roughly 1,400 square feet of usable floor space, he was looking at somewhere between $42,000 and $85,000 for the kit itself. The foundation would cost additional, but he knew now what he hadn't known before, which was that a properly engineered gravel pad or a series of concrete piers could serve as an adequate foundation for a steel arch building, eliminating the cost and complexity of a full-poured concrete perimeter foundation. Mechanical systems, plumbing, heating, electrical, would add more. But even at the high end, with a contractor handling the mechanical work and Thomas providing significant labor himself, he was looking at a total project cost well under $150,000 for a structure that would likely outlast any stick frame house he could have built. He called 4 manufacturers. He asked hard questions about panel thickness, about insulation options, about what happened to structures in seismic events, about what kind of foundation was genuinely necessary in the soil conditions, about how many men it took to erect a kit and how long it took. He took notes. He asked follow-up questions. One manufacturer, based in the Midwest, had a technical representative who had actually been to Alaska, who had worked on projects near Talk and near Kodiak, and who talked to Thomas for nearly 2 hours across 3 separate phone calls without once trying to close a sale. Thomas eventually ordered his kit from that company. He spent the following spring and early summer preparing the site himself. He rented a mini excavator and a plate compactor and spent 3 weeks clearing, grading, and compacting a building pad. He brought in gravel in stages, compacting each lift before adding the next, building up a pad that was level to within an inch across its entire surface. He hired a structural engineer in Fairbanks, a straightforward man named Kowalczyk, who had worked on dozens of unconventional structures across the interior, to review the pad design and specify the anchor bolt pattern for the arch building's base plates. Kowalczyk charged him $1,800 and spent an afternoon on the property, walking the site, probing the soil, asking Thomas questions about frost depth and drainage. He stamped the drawings without drama. The kit arrived on 2 flatbed trucks in late July. Thomas took 3 weeks off on the slope, and his brother drove up from Anchorage with his 2 teenage sons, and the 4 of them erected the structure over 11 days. The manufacturer's instructions were detailed and logical, organized in a sequence that assumed no prior construction knowledge. The arch panels interlocked along their edges, each one going up in sequence from the base plate to the peak. The first panels were the hardest, getting them plumb and properly anchored before there was any structure to brace against. But after the first several were up and temporarily braced, the system became self-reinforcing. By the 5th day, they had the full arch in place, and Thomas stood inside a building for the first time on his own property, looking up at the curved steel ceiling and listening to the wind move across the outside surface with sound that was nothing like he expected. Not loud, not threatening, just a low, sustained tone that reminded him of being inside a very large instrument. The end walls went up over the following 3 days. Thomas had specified framed end walls rather than steel panels, which allowed for more flexibility in window and door placement, and gave him the option to add more windows later without cutting through steel. He had positioned a large window on the south-facing end wall to capture passive solar gain. In interior Alaska, the winter sun stays low on the horizon, but is present for several hours a day, and a south-facing glazed surface can contribute meaningfully to interior temperatures on clear days when it matters most. The north-facing end wall had a single window and the main entry door, positioned to minimize cold air infiltration during the months when the temperature outside bore no resemblance to anything the lower 48 would recognize as winter. Insulation was where Thomas spent the most time researching and the most money. A steel building without proper insulation is essentially a refrigerator. The metal conducts cold efficiently, and condensation on interior surfaces can cause serious problems over time. Thomas used a combination of closed-cell spray foam applied directly to the interior of the steel panels, followed by a layer of rigid foam board, followed by a vapor barrier and a finishing layer of OSB on a hat channel system that created a thermal break between the OSB and the steel. The total assembly gave him an R value in the high 30s, not equal to a passive house, but more than adequate for Delta Junction winters, which regularly saw temperatures below -40 and had done so every year for as long as anyone had been keeping records. He hired a local plumber and a licensed electrician for those portions of the work. He made a deliberate decision not to attempt those systems himself, not because he lacked confidence, but because he understood that the risks of getting mechanical systems wrong were different from the risks of imperfect carpentry. He had seen what a failed pressure fitting could do in a structure at 40 below, and had seen what improperly installed electrical work looked like after a few years of thermal cycling in extreme cold. He paid for expertise where expertise mattered. The plumber and electrician between them charged him just under $31,000. He paid them in 2 installments with no drama, and they did the work on time and pulled the permits and passed the inspections. Heating was a wood gasification boiler paired with a propane backup. Thomas had access to timber on his own property. The clearing he had made during site preparation alone had given him several cords of material that he processed and stacked over 2 seasons. The boiler fed a radiant system embedded in a concrete topping slab that he poured over the gravel pad after mechanicals were roughed in. Radiant floor heat in an arch building has a particular advantage. The heat rises through the floor, warms the living space, and the curved ceiling acts as a natural reflector, distributing warmth evenly through the interior without the stratification that plagues tall rectangular rooms. Thomas had read about this property of arch buildings and was quietly pleased to find it worked exactly as described when he fired the system up for the first time in late October and walked barefoot across the slab, while the thermometer outside the window read 22 below. The total cost, when he added everything up, came to $112,000. That included the kit, the site preparation, the foundation, the insulation, the mechanical systems, the doors and windows, the interior finishing work, and every incidental expense he could document. He had done a significant portion of the labor himself. His brother and nephews had contributed 11 days of skilled work that Thomas compensated in the form of a used snow machine for his brother and 2 plane tickets to Seattle for the boys. He did not count his own labor in the total, because he did not think of it that way. He thought of it as a thing he was doing with his time instead of giving that time to someone else. He moved in during November. The first night, the temperature outside dropped to minus 31. Inside, the slab was warm underfoot. The building held steady at 68 degrees with the boiler running on a moderate cycle, and the wind that had been building all afternoon moved across the curved roof without finding anything meaningful to push against. Thomas sat in a chair near the south window with a cup of coffee and was quiet for a long time. He had thought he would feel vindicated. He had expected something sharper, a sense of having beaten the situation, of having recovered what was taken from him. What he actually felt was simpler than that, and harder to name. It was something close to what he felt on the slope when a piece of machinery that had been giving trouble finally ran correctly. Not triumph exactly, but a deep, functional satisfaction that came from having understood a problem clearly and solved it with the means available to him, without asking anyone's permission, and without waiting for a system that had already demonstrated its willingness to fail him. He knew his story was not unique. He had met other men on the slope who had been through similar things, contractors who vanished with deposits, subcontractors who walked off jobs halfway through, change orders that ballooned budgets past any point of recovery. Rural Alaska had a particular vulnerability to contractor fraud because the construction market was thin, the distances were long, the regulatory oversight was stretched across geography that made enforcement difficult, and the people who lived there often had significant savings and limited options for where to spend them. The pattern was almost formulaic. Find someone who had worked hard for years in a remote industry. Find someone who had saved carefully and was ready to build. Offer a reasonable-sounding bid with professional-looking paperwork. Take a large deposit. Disappear before the work was done. The recovery rate for victims was low. The restitution ordered by courts was rarely collected in full. The men who ran these operations understood that the distances involved made them hard to pursue, and that the legal process, even when it eventually worked slowly and returned little. What Thomas had found, what he was still finding, as he talked to other men in similar situations and described what he had done, was that the Quonset approach disrupted that fraud pattern at its foundation. The kit manufacturers were not local fly-by-night operations. They were established national companies with engineering departments and warranties and reputations that had been built over decades. The entire kit was delivered and inspected before $1 of installation labor was paid. The manufacturing and the installation were completely decoupled, which meant the single catastrophic point of failure that had destroyed Thomas's first project, one contractor holding all the money and all the work simultaneously, was structurally impossible. Thomas had paid the manufacturer for materials and received the materials. He had paid the engineer for stamped drawings and received stamped drawings. He had paid the plumber and electrician for specific, inspectable, permit-pulled scopes of work and received exactly those scopes of work. No single entity had been in a position to take everything, because no single entity had ever held everything. The project had been designed from the beginning so that it couldn't be held hostage. He talked about this at a public meeting in Delta Junction the following spring, when the borough was holding a session on rural housing costs. He was not a natural public speaker and did not pretend to be. He stood up and described what happened to him and what he had done about it in the same flat. Even voice he had used in the courtroom in Fairbanks. He showed photographs on his phone, the site preparation, the kit delivery stacked on 2 flatbeds on the Richardson Highway, the arch going up day by day, the finished interior with the morning light coming through the south window and landing across the concrete floor in a way that looked nothing like what anyone expected a Quonset hut to look like on the inside. A few men asked questions afterward. One of them, a man named Reuben who ran a welding shop outside of Talk, had been watching a neighbor go through almost exactly the same contractor situation Thomas, had survived, and wanted to know where Thomas had ordered the kit. Thomas gave him the phone number and the name of the technical representative he had worked with. Two other men took photographs of Thomas's photographs with their own phones. The building itself continued to perform through its first full winter and into the second. Thomas had been concerned about condensation management. In subarctic climates, moisture control inside a steel structure is not a secondary consideration, and buildings with improperly designed vapor assemblies can develop problems that take years to become visible and cost more to correct than they would have cost to prevent. His assembly held. The vapor barrier he had installed between the spray foam and the rigid foam board was doing its job, and the heat recovery ventilator he had added to the mechanical system kept the interior air clean and fresh without bleeding meaningful heat to the outside. He tracked the interior humidity through both winters, and it stayed within acceptable ranges even during the coldest stretches, when the temperature differential between inside and outside was more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the potential for condensation on any thermal bridge was significant. He had not built a conventional house, and he did not pretend otherwise. The interior was not what most people picture when they imagine a home. The curved ceiling required some adjustment in how he thought about furniture placement and storage, and there was no traditional second story because the geometry of the arch didn't accommodate a full upper floor in a way that a rectangular structure would. He had built a sleeping loft at one end of the building, accessed by a ship's ladder, that sat above the main living area and captured the warmth that collected near the top of the arch on cold nights. The main floor was open and functional, with a kitchen at one end and a living space at the other, and the bathroom and utility room partitioned along one side wall where the ceiling came lower and the curve was less pronounced. It worked. Every part of it worked. It was not what he had imagined standing in the clearing 11 years ago. It was better in some ways, different in others, and he had built it himself, with his own labor and the labor of men who had shown up because he asked them to, and with money that he had not handed to someone who stole it. That distinction mattered to Thomas in a way that was difficult to fully articulate, but that he felt clearly every time he came back from a rotation on the slope and turned down the road toward his property and saw the arch of steel rising out of the birch trees, the flue pipe putting up a column of smoke that the wind pulled apart above the tree line, the clearing he had made by himself holding something real and solid and permanent in the middle of the Alaskan interior. He was 46 years old. He owned the land and the building on it, free and clear. No bank held paper on it. No contractor held leverage over it. No one was in a position to threaten it or withhold it or walk away from it. The building would outlast him. The original military Quonsets that had been properly cared for were still structurally sound after 80 years of standing in climates that had not been gentle with them. Thomas did not know if he believed the most optimistic projections about what his building might eventually prove capable of enduring, but he believed the underlying principle without reservation. The arch form was not a trend. It was not a novelty. It was geometry. The same geometry that held up Roman aqueducts and cathedral vaults and tunnel roofs in hard rock mines for centuries before anyone thought to stamp out a corrugated steel and ship it on a flatbed truck to the interior of Alaska. He had been lied to once, in the deep and calculated way, and it cost him most of what he had spent the better part of 2 decades accumulating in a place where the cold was a permanent condition, and the work was hard, and the isolation was real, and the sacrifice was constant. He had not let that be the last thing the story said about him. He had found a different way and built it himself, and now it stood on his land in all weather, exactly as it was supposed to, doing nothing dramatic, simply holding against everything that Alaska sent at it with the quiet persistence of a form that had been working for 100 years and showed no signs of stopping. That was the part he thought about when the wind came down off the mountains and moved across the roof with that low, sustained sound. Not a threat, just a tone. And the floor was warm under his feet, and outside the temperature was doing what it always did in interior Alaska in the deep of winter, which was something that no one who had not lived it would quite believe was possible, and which the building around him addressed with complete and total indifference.